we're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am very excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Olivia Nuamah. She is the National Inclusion, Diversity, and Belonging Leader at PwC Canada. Olivia, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Thanks so much for having me. My pronouns are she, her, hers. How did I answer that question? Well, interestingly, I was just reflecting on the fact that I didn't know how to answer that question because I didn't know that the job I was doing now even existed. And so I remember being completely starry-eyed when I would be asked, apart from, maybe being a model or an entertainer. Don't ask where that came from. But mostly, if I'd had the words, it'd be what I'm doing right now.
I love that. You fast forward to today, you're at PwC Canada, you're leading the inclusion, diversity team and belonging. How do you think your personal journey has really led you up until this point?
Well, it's interesting because I have said to more than one person that I never, ever imagined being here. I never imagined working in a profit-making organization of any kind. I always saw myself as a nonprofit worker, working in government, working in community, but never working in a corporation, really. And I think what brought me here, the career journey that did, was partially my own, one can call it bias, one can call it value system, but one that really wanted to make sure that I was working alongside the most socially and economically marginalized. And I've done that all my career. And then I think at some point I decided that it wasn't up to me to decide who was deserving, that advocacy was really about the root kind of causes of why you choose to fight for anybody isn't necessarily about where they are at, but it's about who they are. And so over time, I really came to PwC because I made the decision really that it was about trying to advocate for communities no matter where they were and where they were situated. And because I had never really been in an organization like this one, and definitely felt that there was a change since George Floyd and since the kind of 2 years of COVID and the relook at diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, that I thought, okay, let me give this a try now that I felt that the corporate sector was a little bit more open to hearing different kinds of diversity, voices in diversity.
Absolutely. I think we saw a lot of companies, especially over the past year after George Floyd's murder as well, really lean into diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really ensure that employees feel seen, heard, and understood as well, and that it's a responsibility of the employer there too. I think in a lot of these conversations, a lot of folks ask, how do we know if we are doing a good job? How do we know what to invest in, what gets measured, gets invested in? But we also know that every person in every company is at a different part of their journey. So we're not looking to check the box. We always want to continue learning, but what are qualitative and quantitative ways you think about measuring this dynamic thing of inclusion and belonging?
So I am generally, I always start with the qualitative, to be honest with you. I feel like you don't really know what priorities are unless you talk to people. And if you come from a sort of way of thinking that says the people who are on the receiving end of what you're trying to do should be the ones that dictate what the agenda looks like. For me, the qualitative is very much focused on conversations. It's very much focused on the way in which you structure dialogue and the way in which you seek evidence from that dialogue that you're trying to structure. So for PwC, it was about, these like fireside chats. It was about what we called human connections. And it was also about working with our leadership at any level of the organization to understand how it is they connected with their own teams and their own people. And so we spent many months doing that. And to be honest, every place I go, I tend to find that, you hit a number of kind of birds with one stone, for want of a better phrase, when you're talking to people, because one, you're getting to know them, they're getting to know you, and that really matters. But you're also evidence gathering. So you're as much engaging as you are carrying out research, as you are kind of starting the change management process. And so for me, it's all about how you structure dialogue in the qualitative. In the quantitative, as you move into that, what you're trying to do is drop out priorities from that qualitative dialogue. You're trying to get a sense of what matters to people, what moves them, what they've struggled with. And you want to then try to transform those into the core of your quantitative exercise, which is exactly what we did. So and again, that change management process through the qualitative is also really important because you're building trust. And as you build that trust, when you start the quantitative pieces, you have people hopefully see some of their issues reflected. And as they do, they're more apt to engage with your quantitative exercise. They're more apt to be honest because they've met you, they understand where you're coming from. And so the quantitative for me is very much, it's survey focused, even though, I love to be inside organizations that are bolder about taking more ongoing approaches. I mean, at PwC, we do pulse checks. I love the sort of depth of sentiment analysis. I love the kind of the continuity that's involved in anonymous feedback so that you're consistently getting a sense of what people think and feel with anonymity, where they can be more honest. But, you have to be an organization mature enough to want to confront, anonymous feedback. And, we're trying to mature and grow to that place.
Absolutely. And you want to open up opportunities, avenues for folks to really provide that feedback. Everybody is bringing different lived experiences, even if you're working at the best place also. And to your point as well, you really want to understand what is moving folks, what is motivating folks, and that really changes over time as well. People are at different parts of their careers and different parts of their lives as well in terms of journeys. We know that one study found that 60% of employees say what moves them and what's important to them is that their company is really making an intentional act of caring for their families and their communities and really showing up in every sense of the word. How is PwC Canada really caring for the full lives of employees inside and outside of work?
Well, it's an interesting question, because for us, the journey has been one that's about reconciling who we actually are as opposed to who we want to be or who we'd like to project. There has to be some honest introspection as an organization about where you're at. For us, it really matters that we are wholly transparent about what our journey needs to look like, which means being rather honest about what you don't have in the moment and how you're going to get there. So, and apart from the kind of, and I call them standards, I realize they can't be taken for granted around sort of what we offer in terms of our benefits and the ways in which we have sort of set up our kind of our total reward system is all really about trying to ensure that there's a greater seamlessness between your personal life and your professional life. We've introduced what we are calling kind of team agreements in the context of hybrid working to make sure that, we are all in agreement that the days that we work are very much a collaborative exercise. And in doing that, we're also trying to create environments of a lack of judgment for those of us who have other responsibilities. We're also very much engaged in that dialogue about what disability looks like and the forms in which it takes and how it is that we ensure that we are not placing barriers on anybody to sort of balance their professional and their personal lives. So in addition to kind of all of those things, that underpinning all of that is workplace culture. You can put in as many systems and processes and policies and benefits in place, but if your culture still lacks the fundamentals of flexibility and the fundamentals of trust and support, then no matter what you do, you're still faced with those barriers. And so that is a long-term exercise. That's the one where, and especially if you're a professional services firm, we are one of the oldest in Canada, one of the oldest organizations in Canada. I often reflect on the fact that we're almost as old as the country itself, which means that the culture change process is long, it is definitely more involved, but it is also insider tradition where once we do make that appreciable shift, that shift will sustain as it has sustained so far. And so for us, it is a constant talking about where we're at, where we need to go, how we need to all be working in the same direction to get there. So we can put all of those things in place that we need to put in place around the benefits, around the kind of environment we're in. But ultimately, we are focused on behaviors and we're focused on culture as a sustained way of supporting our people.
Absolutely. I think that transparency piece is really paramount as well, to understand what is the current state, how are people feeling right now, and where do we aspirationally want to be 6 months, a year from now, knowing that that can change, but really understanding where you are as an organization and then taking steps to get to that North Star, to get to that place. You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that you didn't think about kind of a role like this when you were younger or working at a corporation. I think everybody has a unique role to play at an individual level and also at a systemic and company level of creating more diversity, equity, having hard conversations. What unique role do you see private employers playing in creating a more equitable world?
Hugely. Well, you know what? It's so changed over time. There was a time when you'd never expect a corporation to take up space in an environment that wasn't necessarily entirely about profit making, that organizations are even talking about ESG, even talking about diversity as a core value is a movement forward, and a movement forward only, in the last decade, if not less. And so, not to say this hasn't always mattered, it has, that it always hasn't been important, it has, but you're seeing that there's a demand around the quality and the nature of the conversations, what accountability looks like and what impact looks like, which is really being determined more externally as a demand and being met internally as an organization. So I'd say that first and foremost, you're definitely seeing a culture shift. In that, the accountability piece is where I think corporations have absolutely determined that it is necessary to be transparent about where you're at. And so our trust roadmap is definitely an attempt to do that. It's an attempt to say, this is what our recruitment targets need to look like. This is what our leadership needs to look like. We're aggressive over 5 years, even more so aggressive over 10. And I think that that's an important part of contributing to the dialogue around equity. It's the one that says, not just organizations that receive taxpayer dollars, but actually everybody that is based inside our communities has to be accountable to the communities and societies in which they're based in. They have to reflect those things. And so, one, being very public about it is necessary. Two, the necessity of accountability is really important. And that's how you see the needle move over time. As corporations make the decision that they have a responsibility, as with every other service and agency that supports communities and society, so too do they have to be much more public about what those aspirations look like, and then be accountable to whether they meet them or not meet them. And I think in just doing that alone, there's a contribution to a wider world of movement building and change that cannot be unstated.
Absolutely, setting that standard in the industry as an employer of choice as well, and really understanding kind of where you are and holding everyone accountable, holding yourself accountable, and having an ownership mentality no matter where you are in the organization, if you are a formal or informal leader. I know you talked about the trust roadmap and you talked about kind of where you are today. Are there any other ways that you would define where PwC Canada is in their kind of equity and inclusion journey that you'd like to share?
Sure. I think more holistically, one of the things I would say that I appreciate about PwC and many organizations, but particularly in PwC, is the fact that to talk about diversity and equity and inclusion is not necessarily the only place diversity, equity, and inclusion is based. That it isn't just containered in this one place where, unless you see the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, it really has nothing to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're really trying to make the point that actually to have an intersectional identity is everybody's business. That it is not necessarily that you are a person of color. Of course, it matters that you're a person of color. It matters to your journey. It matters to what those barriers look like to you, but that it's not always about othering somebody else, that it is also very much about yourself. And so unless you're kind of willing to be introspective enough to understand where you sit on that continuum, it is kind of hard to consistently talk about it as somebody else and not you, especially if you're, white and able-bodied and you're straight and you're all of those things that one might suggest isn't a barrier. There are hidden disabilities. There are being a member of the LGBTQ2+ community. There's the intersectionalities in all of those things, i.e., being racialized, having a disability, and being a part of the LGBTQ2+. Like those people actually exist. And so it's about so much more than just race. And so at PwC, we've introduced a sort of firm-wide strategy called the New Equation. A part of this strategy is very much about solving complex social problems. So solving complex problems more broadly, for me, solving complex social problems. And this is one of them, right? And it involves diversity, equity, and inclusion. That it doesn't say that doesn't mean it doesn't. And so what we are trying to do at PwC is say it is a part, and not just a kind of part that you shoehorn in, that most of our communities are now pushing towards more than 50%, something other than the majority white population. And so given that, how are we looking at everything we do through the lens of the kind of diversity and multiplicity of not only identities, but our own communities? What does it look like so that we're not consistently talking about this as though it sits somewhere outside of what happens in an organization more broadly? Because for me, it's the thing that happens in an organization more broadly. It is how you describe everybody in your organization as somebody who is diverse, as somebody who deserves equity, and as somebody who wants to be included.
Absolutely. Diversity, equity, and inclusion should be the DNA of decisions we make. It should be embedded throughout the organization, and definitely not a siloed conversation or a separate initiative as well. And to your point around accountability, we are all accountable to these goals, not just Olivia, not just one department, but really everybody who's part of the company. I know you've been talking about organizational strategy and just where we are today. And I know that a lot of organizations, especially over the last 2 years, have been consistently auditing the employee experience, and that's really critical to improve processes. Can you tell me about how you've redesigned a system to be more equitable over the past 2 years? This can be a process, policy, or initiative.
I'd honestly say that for us, we have kind of started from the point of exactly how we talk to people. So if you imagine to kind of go back to my latter point, or the point I just made, if you imagine that it is everything an organization does, then you're hoping that you're starting at the core of something in terms of redesigning how you do things. And for me, that core of that something is, what does the employee voice look and feel like in your organization? Where does it take precedence? Where do you hear the voice of the employee when you are designing whatever either your system or process looks like, or what change looks like? And what I'm trying to advocate for is, at PwC, if you don't know who your team is, if you don't know who your employees are, then everything you do will be slightly left or right of center, depending on where you sit. Mostly it won't be centered. And so for us, the redesign is really about how we engage with our employees. So, and that has, not only does it start with conversations, which is what we did, but then as we moved into the quantitative piece, we made the decision that what we're going to do is consistently go back to our employees and tell them how we're performing on the continuum of their workplace experience, or the quality of their workplace experience. And that isn't always positive. We aren't always successful. We do talk about our failures very openly. When something hasn't worked, we are holding our leaders accountable. And for us, that is a systems change. It's a way of looking it's a way of looking at and centering culture. It's a way of saying, how is it we ensure that the culture that we are creating is completely responsive to the employee, to the people who are ultimately holding up who we are as an organization? What do those conversations look like? How can we raise their expectation of the value they place on their own work so that we place a higher value on them and their own work? And then how do we center that inside our organization to make absolutely sure that if we are getting it wrong, and they tell us that we are doing that, that we have committed to responding to that openly. We are trying to create a different kind of way of communicating with our employee. One that ultimately says, if you aren't happy, then we aren't successful. And so if you imagine that for us, that is the core belief of of the way in which we are going to engage with our employee. That is our systems change. That's the thing that says, we will constantly be in touch with you about what accountability looks like for us in relation to what you've told us you need and want. And in doing that, we are going to continually attempt to reorganize and redirect everything we do so that if your voice isn't present, then we decide it's not worth doing.
Absolutely. I love that. Really thinking critically about the employee voice, especially when conversations are hard. You're getting that constructive feedback, not just positive feedback, and really having an effective conversation with employees as the needle changes, as things change over time as well, and continually up-leveling, and again, being seen, heard, and understood is so important. At the time of this recording, we are in May 2022, and I would love to ask how PwC Canada is honoring and celebrating Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month this year, while also recognizing, I'm sure this is something that you are doing 365 days a year. And also to your point around intersectionality, this is not something where, we're not talking about intersectional identities too, and always wanted to ask.
Lovely. So we have an inclusion, ERGs, if you will, we call ours inclusion networks. And we have one particularly dedicated to East Asians and Southeast Asians in particular. And it is one of our biggest and our most involved. And so we had a range of over 15 activities for Asian Heritage Month, which was amazing. High levels of participation, but so there's that, and there's the eventing, and there's the creating scorecards and getting people to or gamifying going to events, opening people's imaginations and raising awareness. And so all those events are great, and we did tons of those and are feel very positive about that. But there's also something else that I think that we have decided that we're going to deeply engage in. So you talked about our sort of qualitative, quantitative sort of process. And for us, this told us a lot about what was happening with our East Asian and Southeast Asian communities, particularly as they applied to women. But more broadly, they make up the second largest population inside PwC. And we were very disappointed by some of the numbers we saw in terms of progression. They very much fit with the kind of what's going on internationally, i.e. making up a large percentage of our population, and yet relatively an almost infinitesimal percentage of our leadership. real issues around bias, real issues around all of the kind of things that we know, or maybe if we don't know, we need to go and learn, but everything that goes on around, how this group of people are discriminated against, particularly as it applies to, being very good workers who are very efficient and very reliable and hardworking, and really using them as a significant proportion of why quality is sustained, and yet perhaps not recognizing that in the way it needs to be recognized. So that's the one thing. And then the second thing is cultural. It's very much about trying to understand how we relook at the definitions of leadership, how we relook at the definitions of gregariousness, of humility, how that contributes to or not, what strong character looks like in the context of professional work. And so we are having very hard-hitting conversations about those sorts of things, about the ways in which some communities, to some extent, make up a large proportion of support, and yet perhaps not a large enough proportion of progression. And that has meant that our Asian communities are the subject of very deep and meaningful conversations for us about bias, and very deep and meaningful conversations for us about the value placed on the work they do.
Of course, the language that we use matters. Again, having that common framework and also defining what does that mean, what does success look like, and really setting folks up for success, listening to that critical feedback. Olivia, I'm sure you have many of these in your work as a community builder in advancing inclusion and diversity, but what is one of your recent proudest moments doing this hard work?
Actually, it's the example I just gave you, to be honest. I think that, for in diversity work, we can often talk about the things that bubble to the surface. So in this case, and I'm absolutely not at all suggesting that these things aren't important, but looking at race as it applies to Black folk, as it applies to Indigenous folk, as it applies to LGBTQ folk, looking at things because politically they have a kind of different aura around the public discourse, means often the sort of communities that go through significant amounts of race hate, as with East Asian and Southeast Asian communities, go through issues around progression, issues around bias. I think at PwC, I've really been overwhelmed by the opportunities to connect with people on a common understanding of what the manifestations of racism and discrimination look like across different communities, to start to have an intersectional dialogue, to do so on the basis of, a conversation that unfortunately does not appear in as much as it should in our public discourse, and yet is absolutely vital to how we understand the dynamics of race and discrimination. And so I've been hugely overwhelmed actually by PwC in relation to its response. So we had this hard-hitting conversation as we led into our performance review period, and amazingly, the commitment inside our organization to change was so significant that certainly for one of our lines, and it's our biggest, they entirely closed the gap. So the notion of creating a data set that actually reflects what is going on in reality at the moment, saying to people, here's where you need to look in order to ensure that you are creating balanced judgments on people, not entirely bias-free, but bias-free enough so that you're not affecting their life chances. And then to see the result of that be exactly what you wanted it to be, because for a significant proportion of your organization, they heard what you had to say, related it to their practice, made a decision that a change had to be made, and made that change, has been one of the proudest moments that I've had at PwC. And that only happened a couple of weeks ago.
I absolutely love that. Thank you for sharing that example. I think that is a really good one for folks to hear and to kind of see what they can translate into their organization of creating that data set and making sustainable change, closing the gap at their company. Olivia, is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to share with folks who are listening, or underscoring any key takeaways you hope people bring with them?
I don't think so, unless Luann and Julie think. I'm good.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture, Olivia. I enjoyed our
Thank you.
conversation today.
So did I. Thank you so much. Appreciate spending this time with you.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening at AllVoices, we really believe in employers and employees really being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the company to succeed overall. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.